Hello, and welcome to the dungeon. I'm your host, Rob. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look. Hello, and welcome to the dungeon. I'm your host, Rob. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the Contingency Spell. As you can see, the room is slightly set up different this time. I'm using my webcam because I wanted to, actually be able to show my screen and stuff. Don't mind all the thousands of open tabs. They're all just YouTube videos for the most part. Oh, we got some cyberpunk somewhere in there too, but whatever. Anyways, so in my last video we were talking about wizards with action surge, and I kind of actually meant to have a section on contingency as a way of like getting more actions out of our wizard, but I kind of forgot by the time I did the video. It kind of morphed in my head into like just cool combos that we could do as a one-man army kind of thing, right? But I think it's probably for the best because contingency is a very complicated spell, and it's very it's got a lot of moving parts. It's got a lot of different components that we might need to understand, and I think it's worth looking at it specifically. I think that is a very intimidating spell, especially for newer players, but even a lot of veteran players. I know that with the group I'm currently playing with, there's been multiple times over the years where people have said, hey, what do you think would be a good choice for 6th level spells? And along with mass suggestion and things like that, I will usually suggest at some point contingency. And every time I do, someone will be like, contingency? I don't know what that does. They flip open to the book and they read the description, and then they're like, I think I'm just going to take Circle of Death. And I'm like, ugh. Circle of Death, by the way, is a terrible choice, not just compared to contingency, just terrible in general. But anyways, I think that the spell is quite complex, and there's so many options available to use it with, and so many different ways to use it, that it kind of deserves like a sort of spotlight video, right? So that's what we're going to look at in this video here today. We're going to take the spell, we're going to break it down into different pieces, we're going to look at different ways to use it, and different spells to use with it. We're also going to look at some other like non-wizard spells, because even though contingency only appears on the wizard spell list, there are other ways to get it. Obviously, the first choice might be to be a bard and take it as one of our magical secrets. Now, because contingency is a 6th level spell, we wouldn't be able to take it with magical secrets though until at least 14th level, and by then it's competing with things like Force Cage and Simulacrum and other great spells, right? So I get it that you probably might overlook it sometimes, but I do think it's a good choice. And maybe if you're tired of winning every boss fight with Force Cage, or if your dungeon master doesn't want to deal with or you don't want to deal with Simulacrum shenanigans, then maybe try contingency. Or actually, if you just wanted to use simulacrums with contingency for double the shenanigans, that's also a very valid idea. Besides bards, you could also get it as an Arcana Domain Cleric. Their level 17 ability gives them a 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th level spell from the wizard spell list. And contingency is a pretty good choice. Of course, you could also just take Wish as an Arcana Domain Cleric and then cast contingency with Wish, or a Genie, Pact Warlock, or anything like that. In fact, I do want to say that I think Wish to use to cast contingency is actually a very, very valid idea. And the reason I say this is because contingency is a spell that's often best used during downtime or right before a long rest. It has a casting time of 10 minutes normally, right? I'm not going to be using this in combat. I'm probably not casting it in the middle of a dungeon either, even if it's after a fight, probably, right? I mean, maybe, but if my contingency activated, I might want to replace it. But in general, when I cast contingency, I'm going to be using a 6th level spell slot. I'm going to be pairing it with another spell of 5th level or lower, which is going to use that spell slot. That's a heavy commitment, but if I'm about to take a long rest anyway, and I'm just going to get the spell back, it doesn't matter. And that's why I say it's a pretty good choice for a wish spell. Oh, and when I say that, I don't mean like a Ring of Wishes or a Luck Blade or something like that. If I have a limited supply of wishes, I'm not using one of them on contingency. I mean, if I'm high enough level where I can cast Wish every day, I get to the end of the adventuring day and I'm like, saving my 9th level spell slot for like that big boss fight, and I never needed it because it turned out I had Force Cage. So, never needed my 9th level spell slot. And now we're going to stop for the day, I'm going to take a long rest. Kind of wasted my 9th level spell slot because I didn't use it on anything. Well, why not cast contingency and set something up? You're just going to rest anyways, you're going to get the spell slots back, you've really lost absolutely nothing, right? So anyways, like I said, best used during downtime because it has a duration of 10 days, or at the end of an adventuring day so I can set something up. Contingency will take some planning and some foresight, and we're going to talk about that a lot during this video. I actually did a previous version of this video and it was 50 minutes long. We're going to try to shave this one down to 49 minutes or less. Anyways, so let's get into the spell. So it's a 6th level spell, duration of 10 days. That's the big draw here. Casting time of 10 minutes. School evocation, range self, attack save none, components verbal somatic material, damage effect utility. So here's the description. Choose a spell of 5th level or lower that you can cast that has a casting time of 1 action and that can target you. You cast that spell, called the Contingent Spell, as part of casting Contingency, expending spell slots for both, but the Contingent Spell doesn't come into effect. Instead, it takes effect when a certain circumstance occurs. You describe that circumstance when you cast the 2 spells. For example, a Contingency Spell cast with water breathing might stipulate that water breathing comes into effect when you are engulfed in water or a similar liquid. The Contingent Spell takes effect immediately after the circumstance is met for the first time, whether or not you want it to, and then contingency ends. The Contingent Spell takes effect only on you, even if it can normally target others. You can use only 1 contingency spell at a time. If you cast a spell again, the effect of another contingency spell ends, or a spell on you ends. Also, contingency ends on you if its material component is ever not on your person. The material component is a statuette of yourself, carved from ivory, and decorated with gems worth at least 1,500 gold pieces. It's not consumed though, which means that you can just have that one 1,500 investment and then just use it anytime you need contingency, right? You don't have to have 1,000 of them because they keep getting burnt up, right? So let's break this down piece by piece. Basically, we're going to cast contingency. We're going to pair it with another spell. That spell has to be 5th level or lower, and it has to be a spell that we cast. That casting time has to be 1 action as well. So a lot of decent spells that we might have wanted to use don't have a casting time of 1 action. Like, say, Counterspell, for example, uses a reaction. It would have been really nice to be able to say, if somebody casts a harmful spell on me, then Counterspell. Not eligible, though, because it doesn't require an action, it uses a reaction. Same with things like, say, Misty Step or Far Step. Both require a bonus action to cast, not eligible. Dimension Door is eligible, right? There's certain buff spells that have a casting time of, say, a minute or whatever. Not eligible, right? So let's bear that in mind. Think of this. I saw an analogy from the Dungeon Dudes on a video they made about contingency like a year or 2 ago, but it was a good analogy, so I'm going to steal it. Well, I'm not stealing it because I'm giving them credit for it, but whatever. Anyways, he compared it to computer programming language where it's kind of like, if this, then this, right? So it's, if this happens, then cast this spell. Those are the 2 parts of contingency. Now, why would you want to even have a spell like this? Well, there's actually a lot of really good reasons. Let's say, for example, that you're playing a Bladesinger wizard and you set up contingency that if I say the phrase faster than a speeding arrow, I will cast haste on myself. Well, normally I get into a combat, I cast haste, that was my action. I could have been using that action to make 2 attacks, including a booming blade or a green flint blade attack, and then, you know, doing whatever for my turn, but instead I used my action to cast haste. Now, I do get another action from the haste spell, which will allow me to do 1 attack, right? So it's not, you know, it's not like I wasted that turn and did nothing, right? But I could be casting that as a free action, because speaking is a free action. I could even be doing it on somebody else's turn if I wanted to get really daring and hope that I don't get hit hard and lose concentration on a haste before I even get to use it. But you could almost use it like a legendary action almost, right? Where, let's say we've got that Gloomstalker Ranger with Alert and Max Dex and a huge Wisdom bonus to his initiative as well. So he's at like plus 13 or whatever it is, right? But then after him is us. And I'll go, okay, at the end of his turn, I'm going to say my phrase, which is a free action, and it's going to trigger haste. And now in that opening round, I have my 2 regular attacks, and I have my bonus, well, not bonus action, I have my extra action that I got from haste all at the same time. Also, it doesn't count as casting a spell because I didn't cast haste now. I cast haste 5 days ago when I set up the contingency. It also means my haste spell couldn't be counterspelled because I'm not casting haste. I cast it 5 days ago. You needed to counterspell me 5 days ago, not now. Now, I might try to follow that up with a different spell, in which case that could be counterspelled, of course, right? It also means I could be hit with a dispel magic, which could be an issue for me because I might lose everything in that case, right? But, you know, it allows me to get around some cool action economy. It allows me to set things up with different, you know, phrases or activations, like maybe I give the metal horns and then all of a sudden my spell activates or whatever, right? I could also do things like, say, if I'm hit with, you know, some sort of incapacitating spell, then dispel magic, right? And now I don't have to worry about giving a passphrase. What if I'm silenced? What if I'm incapacitated? I might not be able to speak. I might not be able to give the metal horns or whatever else it is, right? I can have different triggers set up where if I'm incapacitated, cast due to magical spells, then cast dispel magic on me, and that'll remove everything. It'll also remove any other buffs I might have too, right? So, you know, be careful because this will require some planning. Remember, you needed to designate all this stuff 5 days ago when you cast your contingency, or 6 days, or 10 days, or 2 days, whatever it was, right? So it does require some foresight and some planning around these specific situations. All right. Anyways, the other thing to note is that basically we're limited to spells that have a range of self, or spells that allow us to target anybody, in which case they must target us. So in the case of haste, for example, let's say you're not a Bladesinger wizard. You might have wanted to cast haste on the fighter, but that's not eligible with contingency. You have to be the target when your contingency spell activates. You could only use that, for example, to cast haste on yourself, right? So anyways, let's take a look. I've got a document I did here. Oops. And we're at the end of that document. Spoiler alert. Nobody cares. Anyways, so contingency basically is going to be broken into 2 parts. We've got the trigger, and then we've got the spell that's going to be activated when that trigger goes off, right? So for the triggers themselves, there's almost an infinite number. Oh, by the way, this is a spell. You definitely want to talk to your dungeon master and make sure you're on the same page for how it's going to work, right? Because there are a lot of, like, you know, ambiguous type of areas, right? Anyways, so the phrases or the triggers, I like to break them down into the ones I use typically are active. That'd be like a phrase or a gesture, or, you know, I rub the amulet on my chest or whatever else, right? Proximity. This could be an example where if I have 2 enemies within melee range of me, then cast mirror image or blink or greater invisibility or whatever my trigger might have been, right? And the last one is situational. So if I'm reduced to 25% of my health or less, then cast Odalux Resilient Sphere, for example, right? And the nice thing about active ones is that they're way less likely to get accidentally triggered. Because let's say I use a situational one to cast Polymorph on myself to turn myself into a T-Rex, right? If I'm reduced to 25% hit points or less, turn me into a T-Rex. Well, the nice thing about that is that it doesn't matter if I'm silenced or anything else, right? None of that's going to matter. I'm going to turn into a T-Rex as soon as I hit that damage threshold. The downside, though, is that what if I hit that damage threshold in, let's say, the last round of the fight? Let's say we kill the big boss, but we're still cleaning up his minions, and then somebody hits me, and all of a sudden I drop to 24.9% of my hit points, and suddenly I turn into a T-Rex. Well, I mean, it's nice that I'm not going to go down, but at this point the fight is basically over and we're just doing the cleanup. We're just mopping up the last few minions. I really didn't want my spell to activate here, right? If I have an active trigger, I don't really have to worry about that. Active triggers also allow me to, like, really plan some, like, big burst damage, like Nova type rounds. Look, let's say I have a phrase where I could cast Thunderstep, for example. Now I move into a bunch of enemies, I hit them all with a bunch of damage, I haven't even cast a spell yet, so I'm now eligible to cast a spell of whatever type I wanted, right? And, you know, I could get a leveled spell plus my Thunderstep all in the same turn. I've got some movement attached here, you know, it could really set up some big, like, Nova potential, right? And it's a lot easier to do that stuff when I'm in control of when my spell activates. Like I said, the downside though is that I could be incapacitated or silenced or whatever else might happen, and now I'm not able to activate it, right? Proximity is also useful because let's say I don't know that I'm in danger. Like a spell that I usually wouldn't consider for this because it's a little on the weaker side, but is actually great with contingency, is See Invisible. The problem with invisible foes and with the See Invisible spell itself is that if I need See Invisible, I probably didn't know I needed it because they're invisible, right? If I knew that I was fighting somebody invisibly, that might be a different story. But then I have to cast the invisible and now it's taking my action. What if I set up my spell so that I say, okay, if there is a hostile invisible creature within line of sight of me, because the range on See Invisible is line of sight, then cast See Invisible. And now I don't even know there's an enemy there, but they're hostile, they're within line of sight of me, and now all of a sudden my spell activates. Not only can I now see the target, but it actually alerted me to the fact that there was a target there, which I wouldn't have even known otherwise, right? So it's kind of got this dual purpose in this case, where not only is it giving me the benefits of being able to see invisible, but it's actually working like a divination spell almost, and revealing a danger that I was actually unaware of entirely. So even though See Invisible itself is kind of a weaker choice normally, well, not a weaker choice, but you know, we can have up to 5th level spell slots, right? Or 5th level spells. So, you know, you'd think that 4th and 5th would be the go-to choices. I'm just saying that in some cases, there's spells that have utility that we might really, really want in this kind of situation. On the other hand, something like, say, Tongues would be a really bad choice, because usually I don't need Tongues in like an emergency right now situation, right? I could probably cast it when we're not in combat and then speak with whoever I needed to speak with, right? So Tongues would be a very, very poor choice in this case. And in fact, most spells that I could cast as a ritual are usually going to be poor choices. Even the water breathing example that they give in the spell, I think is a decent choice because, you know, maybe you didn't know you're going to be engulfed in water and now you're going to die, right? That's obviously bad. On the other hand, if I know I'm going on a sea voyage and there's a chance we might end up in the water, I could have just ritually cast water breathing at the start of the day and not used contingency with it. I could have used that with, say, See Invisible or Greater Invisibility or whatever else. Oh, excuse me. So these are the triggers I generally like: active, proximity, and situational. Active are usually my favorite because it gives me more control, but depending on what the situation is, like I said, like a Dispel Magic, if I'm held with, or affected by negative magical effects, that's a great way to use the spell, right? See Invisible, if I have, the target like we mentioned, that's great too. Anyways, I've broken most of this stuff into spells that use concentration and spells that don't, and I've broken them into broad categories like defensive, movement, utility, offensive, whatever, right? Now, obviously, some of these categories are a little blurry, right? Like, is haste a movement spell, or is it a defensive spell because it gives me armor class? Or is it an offensive spell because it gives me more attacks, right? Obviously, some of these have multiple purposes. Don't get too hung up on whether or not I listed it in one category or another. That's not what's important, right? The reason I mentioned concentration, though, is that especially if I'm using, say, a proximity or situation-based one, I might not want it to activate if it's going to cause me to lose concentration on whatever spell is casting, right? So let's say we get into a big fight, I cast Wall of Force, and I'm concentrating on Wall of Force. All of a sudden, my Greater Invisibility spell activates, which I had set up a contingency, and now I'm invisible, which is nice, but I lost Wall of Force, which was probably better because I'd specifically chosen that for that situation rather than just the general purpose of contingency, right? It's also bad if I'm fighting something that has True Sight, and now my Greater Invisibility is completely worthless, and Wall of Force is now gone. I've got the worst of everything in that case, right? So anyways, I've listed spells here that I think are at least worthy of consideration. Some are obviously better than others, right? Intellect Fortress. Not a bad spell. You can set it up that if I have to make, the saving throws affected or whatever else, then Intellect Fortress, right? And, have advantage on those saving throws is pretty decent. Invisibility and Greater Invisibility. Obviously, Greater Invisibility is a better choice here. If you have the option of taking Greater Invisibility, way better. If I only have invisibility, I might not even bother, to be honest. I also put down Mislead. Again, greater invisibility is just better usually, but Mislead does leave a like handy decoy, which could be useful under certain circumstances. So I think it's at least worth mentioning, and I would probably, I'd probably list them as like greater invisibility, Mislead, invisibility, kind of, if I was to like, rank them in terms of those similar type of spells, right? Polymorph, or greater invisibility, by the way, is just one of your best choices anyways for this type of purpose, in my opinion. Although it does suffer at higher levels because we start fighting more things with True Sight, obviously. Polymorph. Remember, it has to target you, so you can't polymorph. If player X, or if any player in my party is reduced to 25 hit points or less, then polymorphs them into a T-Rex. Doesn't happen. Has to be you, right? Also, like I said, not only is there a chance that it might go off at an inopportune time, like at the end of the combat, like I already mentioned, but what if you're in a dungeon and there's only like a 10-foot high ceiling? You might not want to turn into a T-Rex. That could be really bad. So, be aware that there are some dangers there. That being said, though, turning into like a giant ape or something like that, or like in my campaigns, we usually use all the Kobold Press monster manual books, and there's a beast called the Savager, which is like a CR8, and it's like a giant bear combined with a porcupine. My players love polymorphing things into this because it does ridiculous amounts of damage. So that's usually our go-to polymorph choice, Savager. Anyways, polymorph is a great choice though, because not only can it like help to save you from going down into combat, but it also still gives you a lot of utility, right? Like say, one of the spells I'm going to mention next is Odalux Resilient Sphere. Odalux Resilient Sphere, or let's just call it Resilient Sphere, is probably the best defensive, like pure defensive option, period. The problem is, it also kind of removes me from the fight. Sure, nothing can hurt me, but I can't really do anything to them either. And that might not be really what I want. Polymorph, sure, I'm going to be concentrating on it, and now I'm not casting other spells, but at least I'm still able to attack. I'm still able to contribute to the fight. One danger of Polymorph, though, is that beasts tend to have garbage armor class, and if I'm still getting hit a lot, I'm going to have to make a lot of concentration saving throws, and if I fail one of those, I'm going to be back in my fragile wizard body with, whatever my trigger was, say 25% hit points or less, right? So that could be a, bad situation to end up in. Anyways, Resilient Sphere. I already talked about this one. One of the best defensive options you have. If you want pure defense, hard to go wrong. Blur. Blur to me is an inferior choice because it suffers from all the same problems that greater invisibility do, meaning things with True Sight, Blind Sight, etc. And it's just a worse spell than greater invisibility. Greater invisibility isn't just for attacking with advantage and disadvantage, by the way. We had a bard in one of my campaigns who just abused the heck out of greater invisibility by turning invisible and then casting spells, and people couldn't counterspell him because they couldn't see him. So, I mean, obviously, if they had True Sight, they can, but left a lot of people who couldn't counterspell the bard, and now he's just like raining spells down on them. Usually crowd control spells, too. So, I listed Blur. I guess, like, maybe if you've got only access to, like, a couple low-level spells, or if you got, contingency from some other source, Blur, it's still an option. Just to me, it's a much weaker choice than some of the others. So anyways, moving on. Defensive without concentration. Man, this is going to be longer than the original video, not shorter. Anyways, Mirror Image. I find that Mirror Image is a great spell when I'm lower levels, but as I start to get to higher and higher level, the opportunity cost of casting Mirror Image in that first round of combat or whatever, it just starts getting really high. I could have been casting like 6th level spells at this point, and instead I'm casting Mirror Image in the opening round, But what if I can just activate Mirror Image without having to spend a round casting it? Suddenly, it becomes a pretty decent defensive option. And the thing I like about it compared to Greater Invisibility, even though Greater Invisibility is clearly the better spell, Mirror Image does not require a concentration. So if we wanted to be, we could be Mirror Imaged and Hasted, for example. We could be still maintaining concentration on that Wall of Force, but now we've got Mirror Image up. Blink, good option as well. Dispel Magic, I already talked about this, but if harmful spells are affecting me, then Dispel Magic. It'll remove my other buffs and stuff as well. So that could be bad. But, you know, again, if I'm incapacitated, like let's say I get hit with a hold person spell, I can't say my phrase to activate a spell. So just having that kind of situational spell just automatically dispel me can be really, really good. This is also probably a good time to mention that if we look at contingency, there was actually nothing in the spell description allowing us to upcast spells. So dispel magic, if we're trying to dispel higher spell slots, or higher level spells, sorry, then we actually need to make a roll unless we upcast a spell magic. This is going to be important when we talk about spells like, say, Armor of Agathis you might have gotten just by dipping one level of Warlock or taking, a feat or whatever else, right? Cure Wounds. If you can upcast Cure Wounds, that becomes a pretty decent option. But there's nothing listed in the spell that talks about upcasting stuff with spell slots. It only talks about spells as, 5th or lower level spells. So definitely talk to a Dungeon Master. If you can upcast certain spells, like if you could cast a spell magic with a 5th level spell slot, obviously that's better than a 3rd. If you can't though, dispel magic still remains a good choice. But things like Armor of Agathis and Cure Wounds become much weaker choices. We'll talk about those at the end of the video, right? Either way though, definitely talk to your Dungeon Master. Rules as written, there's nothing saying you can, so I would be kind of hesitant to allow players to upcast spells with contingency. Anyways, Fire Shield. Fire Shield is a pretty good spell normally. It's one that I don't really like to cast a lot though because it's using that action. And again, this becomes a great idea to use with contingency, especially because I could have it set up for multiple things. Maybe let's go back to that Blade Singer example because now I can get the Thorns effect of Fire Shield, right? But I'm also getting resistance, everything else, right? It's got so much there that if I'm able to just like activate it instantly without having to cast a spell and use my action, this becomes a great option. But I could even have it set up as a trigger, right? Because remember, things like shield and absorb elements are not eligible. Those are reactions. Although absorb elements is good enough that I don't really care, right? Same with shield, just saying. But, I could have it set up that if I take cold damage, then fire shield. If I take fire damage, then cold shield. Whatever, right? So I think it's a very strong option, especially if I'm playing a more Gish character where I can really benefit from the Thorns. And of course, because it's not using concentration, it becomes a real standout choice. Utility. Telekinesis was the only one that really stood out to me, but it's a great spell, so solid option. Without concentration though, we already talked about seeing invisible, we won't go into a lot of detail, but just the idea that I could trigger it and it can alert me, or it can trigger proximity based, and it can alert me that there's an invisible creature that's hostile that I wouldn't have even known was there, so I wouldn't have cast the invisible to begin with. That can be very, very helpful. Movement. I put fly and gaseous form, and I usually consider gaseous form to be a very inferior choice compared to the fly spell. But once again, the dungeon dudes actually made a really strong case for gaseous form with contingency as a more defensive option. So if you just want to have an activated trigger and you can fly and then rain spells down on non-flying targets, especially ones without ranged weapon attacks, then use fly. But if you're more worried that like, hey, what if I get in trouble and I want to be able to like escape from the situation but not necessarily abandon my allies and leave the combat, gaseous form is going to allow us to fly. It'll also allow us to fit like under doors or into containers or whatever else, right? It's going to give us resistance to like physical damage types and stuff. So it has a lot more defensive utility, where if I kind of want to combine fly with these other aspects of defense, it actually becomes a really, really solid choice to use with contingency. So it's definitely worth mentioning. I still don't know that I like it as much as a lot of the other options we have, but it's not the worst choice we could make, that's for sure. Movement without concentration. One I see a lot of people talk about is Dimension Door. And it is a good choice. I don't want to sound like I'm hating on Dimension Door, but it does have some problems. Again, rules as written, when you cast Dimension Door, you have to determine how far you want to go up to the spell's range and the direction you want to go in. But remember, you're casting Dimension Door 5 days ago or 3 days ago, whatever it was, right? You're not casting it at the time when it activates. So, saying like, oh, I'm going to teleport 500 feet, in this direction, in the direction I'm facing, or whatever. Well, that might sound great when you're in camp and you're about to take a long rest and get your spell slots back. But what if it actually activates and it teleports you into a bunch of rock, or into a bunch of lava, or, over a cliff? Hopefully you have Feather Fall. That might not be the end of the world, right? The point is that if my Dungeon Master allows me to choose the target then when it activates, that's not so bad. But rules as written, that's not how it's supposed to work. It's supposed to work that you designated that when you cast a spell, and because you cast a spell 5 days ago, you needed to make those decisions then. And you don't know which way or how far you necessarily want to go when it's going to activate. And so to me, there are some dangers with Dimension Door. Now, other people have pointed this out online as well. It's not just me noticing this. And one solution I've seen is that, how about I have it teleport me, like, say, 500 feet up into the air, and then I have Feather Fall prepared, so, it's not going to kill me or anything like that, right? And then it doesn't really matter which direction I wanted to go in. I don't have to worry about this stuff. I'm just going to go straight up. And if I'm not, like, say, in a dungeon or in an Underdark campaign, that's a good choice. But if I am, again, problem issues. So just be aware, Dimension Door still remains a really solid choice, but there are some problems that, logistically you might need to be concerned about. Thunderstep. Speaking of movement and offense, this could have fallen into both categories. Thunderstep's actually the one I prefer over Dimension Door, because it has this offensive component to it as well, right? Where I can Thunderstep, do a bunch of damage, then follow that up with some sort of spell that I want to cast, like maybe a Wall of Force or whatever else, or just more damage, it's fine. Or maybe something like a Fear Spell is a decent choice. I Thunderstep into a bunch of guys, hurt them all, and then because it's a cone, and I kind of need to be close, well, now I fear them all with my Fear Spell, and now I don't have to worry about everybody ganging up on me, because half of them, or 3/4 of them, are all going to be running away, and my allies are hopefully going to mop up the rest, right? Thunderstep really allows you to set up some like nice big burst Nova type of rounds, and it's one of my personal favorites to use this. I kind of like the fact that I can like activate it deliberately and set up these like big combo rounds, right? Anyways, what was it? Haste. There we go. So, offensive options, like I said, Haste and Vampiric Touch were the two I mentioned. We've already talked about Haste a lot. There's probably no point going into more detail of it. We all know Haste. It's a great spell. Nothing wrong there. One nice thing about Haste over other options, like say Greater Invisibility, is that we don't have to worry about some of these other problems like True Sight or whatever, right? We're still getting that extra action regardless, Vampiric Touch. I generally prefer Haste, but this is a pretty strong option too, especially if I'm playing something like a Blade Singer and, even though I'm fairly mobile and I've got my Blade Song going, so my armor class is actually pretty decent, I'm also still a squishy little wizard. And sometimes just being able to restore some health and do some damage at the same time is actually really, really nice. So, Vampiric Touch, still a pretty good option. It's also really good if you're getting a contingency through other means and you don't necessarily have, those kind of high damage options that someone like a Blade Singer would have had naturally, right? Anyways, offensive without concentration. I didn't list anything here because most of the good offensive spells are spells that aren't eligible, right? Things like Fireball. Well, Contingency has to be a spell that targets us. Unless we want to Fireball ourselves, that's probably not a great option, and technically that targets an area anyway, so you know what I'm saying, right? We're not going to Scorching Ray ourselves, etc., 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 right? So most of the spells we wanted aren't going to work. Anyways, moving on to other classes spells. And it's at this point I want to introduce an idea which I'm not 100% sure technically works. So, I might need a fact check false or something like that. But, rules as written, I think this should work. And more astute people may have noticed I have a Dungeon Master's Guide strategically open beside me to the page I need. And this is the Ring of Spell Storing. So it's a rare ring and it requires attunement. Let's read it. This ring stores spells cast into it, holding them until the attuned wearer uses them. The ring can store up to 5 levels worth of spells at a time. When found, it contains 1d6 minus 1 of those stored spells chosen by the DM. Any creature can cast a spell of 1st through 5th level into the ring. 1st through 5th level, how convenient, right? By touching the ring as the spell is cast. The spell has no effect other than to be stored in the ring. If the ring can't hold the spell is expended without effect. The level of the spell slot you use to cast a spell determines on how much space it uses. So in this case, we could upcast spells, it appears. Anyways, while wearing this ring, you can cast any spell stored in it. The spell uses the spell slot, spell save DC, spell attack bonus, and spell casting ability of the original caster, but is otherwise treated as if you cast the spell. The spell cast from the ring is no longer stored in it, freeing up space. So here's what I'm saying. Let's say you have a cleric or a druid or a bard or whatever in the party. They could cast a spell into your ring of spell storing. And then when you cast Contingency, you use the spell from your ring, which now counts as if you'd cast it. And Contingency just requires that you cast the spell. And I think this should allow you to use like cleric or druid spells even without multiclassing into those classes, which means that a wizard could use their party members' spells cast into the ring to set up with Contingency. And that, this is in addition to the idea of bards taking it, arcana to make clerics, people using it with wish, etc., etc. And it really opens up a lot of interesting and intriguing options, I think. So even if you can't use the ring the way I just described, it's still worth looking at these spells, because like I said, there are other ways to get it. But I really, really like the idea of my wizard having a ring of spell storing, which is already a great item, by the way. Let's be honest, right? But using that, we're like, Druid, recharge my freedom of movement spell. Contingency, freedom of movement. Great stuff. Anyways, does freedom of movement actually use concentration? I listed it. Okay, I'll figure it out later, or you can look it up yourself. I listed it as other classes spells using concentration, but I don't think freedom of movement actually requires concentration. Anyways, whatever. Not important. I probably just put it in the wrong category. Maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, so I listed Beacon of Hope. Personally, I think this is a pretty poor choice unless I'm able to do a lot of healing. Because remember, this is just going to allow the healing spells to be maximized. And, if I'm not planning on healing people, because I'm a wizard, for example, it's pretty subpar. However, if I'm a healer, then this becomes a pretty solid option. Because having to waste a round casting my Beacon of Hope and then healing people is just really, really off-putting to me. If they needed a heal, they probably need the heal now. They don't really care if they're getting back, 7 hit points returned from that Aura of Vitality or 12 right away. They just need the healing right now, But if I could just activate it, oops, I just bumped my thing. If I could just activate it as a, command phrase and then begin immediately healing for max effect, this is actually really, really good, especially if I'm healing lots of people at once. So I do think that in certain cases, if I'm a healer, this becomes a pretty good option, right? On the other hand, Aura of Vitality is a terrible choice because it also requires concentration. Mass Cure Wounds or whatever else, right? Anyways, I think it becomes a good option if I'm going to be doing a lot of healing. But otherwise, like if I was a wizard, I would never, ever consider that one, right? I think I wrote down, let's mention a few that are eligible. I wrote down Dark Vision and then put pretty questionable in brackets. It's actually very, very, very questionable. So it's actually worse. I think I oversold it by saying it was pretty questionable. So Dark Vision, sure, you could use that with Contingency, but I just feel like the effect isn't strong enough to justify it, right? I also wrote down Feign Death. Feign Death is a decent enough spell. I just think that there's so many better options, though. And depending on the intelligence of the creature, the DM might just have it keep mauling you anyways, or maybe it can see through your Feign Death, I don't know. It's not that Feign Death is a bad spell. It's just you have 100 other options that are competing with it for your Contingency, And I feel like so many of them are stronger, right? I also wrote down bark skin. Obviously, do not use it with bark skin. Again, eligible, but way too weak, right? So anyways, here are some of the good ones, though, that I did like. I put down freedom of movement. And honestly, I think freedom of movement is one of the best ones you can use. I like the idea of setting it up situationally where it's like, maybe I say, if any unwanted effect impedes my movement, then freedom of movement. And now if I get hit with, it'll get rid of hold person, so it has some of that same functionality that a spell magic might have had, right? But it also will help against things like Evoid's Black Tentacles. It'll help against like grapples and, Bigby's hands and whatever else it might have been that was impeding my movement. Now it's not. And I personally think this is a great effect, especially because it could happen even if I'm silenced, even if I'm incapacitated. There's a very strong chance that it's still going to be able to remove a lot of those things, or at least get me, allow me to get out of the silenced area because now my movement isn't being impeded. Imagine getting hit with Evoid's Black Tentacles in an area where you're silenced. Now you're really screwed. But hey, not you, because you got freedom of movement activated from your contingency spell. Anti-life shell. I just realized I put down Anit life shell. Anit life shell is a terrible spell. You should never select it. Anti-life spell, on the other hand, is a great choice. Basically just keeps out everything except undead. So, as long as you're not in the Walking Dead universe, you're probably going to be pretty happy with that choice. It's a very, very strong defensive choice. I like it a lot. I also put down protection from energy. And this is also a good choice if I think I'm going to be exposed to like elemental damages a lot. Remember, things like absorb elements is a reaction, so it wasn't eligible. It's also just a first level spell slot, though, which is why I like it so much. I think absorb elements is a great choice. But, protection from energy. If I take energy damage, then protection from energy, give me resistance to all that stuff, and it'll last way longer. I think it'll last an hour, I think. Just a very, very strong choice. I like that one a lot, too. I also listed Freedom of the Winds, which is actually Critical Role specific. I'm not as familiar with the spell as I probably should be because it's Critical Role, and we don't really use Critical Role stuff. But I figured at least mention it because it is a great spell. I think it's Druid only, and it combines flight, but it also has a chance to teleport you out of hostile spells, and if you get out of the range, then that spell fails. But I think it also ends Freedom of Wind. So, don't do that when you're 600 feet in the air unless you also have Featherfall, right? Either way, I just threw it in there because I thought it was an interesting choice. So then we have other class of spells without concentration. And remove Curse. This is a decent option, but again, I feel like it's kind of a weaker choice. Excuse me. I don't know that I really need remove Curse as like an emergency function, right? It's not like the spell Magic, where it's like, oh, I just got hit with harmful spells, get rid of those now, because I'm in trouble. Remove Curse is often a case where it's like, I can cast it out of combat, and I'm probably going to be fine, right? So, I think it's worthy of consideration, but it's like way down here on the list, whereas, a lot of spells are up here, right? Armor of Agathis, or Githis, or however it's pronounced. If I'm allowed to upcast it, it's actually a pretty strong option. But if it's just going to give me 5 temporary hit points and a 5-point Thorn Shield, not even worth considering. But, I at least wanted to mention it because, again, let's say I'm playing that Blade Singer Wizard, but I took, Magic Initiate or something and grabbed Armor of Agathis. I can catch it with my Wizard spell slots or whatever. Or maybe I took one level of Hex Blade or whatever the case was, right? It's a very strong spell if I can outcast it with a 5th level spell slot. Not so much if I can't, right? Same with Cure Wounds. Cure Wounds would still have the effect that it could bring you up if you get downed in combat, right? But, I think there's just better options. Like, are you really going to tell me that going down and then coming back up with 5 or 8 hit points was better than just getting polymorphed into a giant ape? if you have 5 hit points, you're probably just going to go down again anyways, right? Greater Restoration and Lesser Restoration. Obviously, Greater Restoration is the better pick here, but I figured I'd mention Lesser Restoration in case in case you're a wizard who dipped a class with Lesser Restoration. You might not be high enough to get Greater Restoration, right? You're not going to have 6th level wizard spells and 5th level cleric spells, for example, right? But if you do, great, but if you don't, then Restoration is a decent option, but you might just wait till after combat and cast it. Greater Restoration, on the other hand, is quite powerful, and it's very easy to trigger, where you just if any of the conditions that Greater Restoration cures are hit on me, then Greater Restoration, right? Simple enough. Another one is Death Ward. And again, I want to give credit where it's due. I think it was Bibron and Dragon's channel. I saw his idea of having your Death Ward triggered by your Death Ward being triggered. So in other words, you cast Death Ward, and your contingency is, if my Death Ward triggers, then cast Death Ward. And his idea was that, again, if Death Ward triggers, it's nice that I didn't go down, but I'm sitting at 1 hit point, right? I'm just going to get hit again, and I'm probably going to go down. So his idea is, if I get hit, my Death Ward triggers, then recast Death Ward, and now if I get hit again, that Death Ward will trigger. And it's just kind of like a backup for your backup, And I thought it was a clever idea. My only caution there is, make sure you actually remember to cast Death Ward every day, though, because otherwise, your Death Ward isn't ever going to be cast, meaning that it won't actually trigger, and therefore your contingency, which relies on your Death Ward triggering, won't trigger. So, caution is needed in that case. Again, I'm sure there's a million other choices that people can make, but these were the ones that I really liked and the ones that kind of stuck out to me. And I think that Contingency is such a cool spell. There's so much you can do with it. There's so many different ways to really take advantage of it. It has so much potential that I just kind of want people to make better use of it. That all being said, I'm sure there are a lot of combinations that I probably missed or forgot about, or that just didn't even occur to me or whatever, and that's fine. But we're going to end things there. Thank you for watching. Feel free to like, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, and most importantly, leave your comments in the comment sections. I would love to see other people's combos or things they've done with Contingency, different triggers that maybe they've thought of using that I didn't mention here, because the truth is that there's almost an infinite number of triggers that you could use to cool effect, and I think that honestly, coming up with good triggers and matching those to the right spells is a big part of using Contingency well, So anyways, that's everything. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.